Alright guys, so this is to walk you guys through 4 poems that really focus on syntax and sort of speaker context. So Evolution by Sherman Alexie. Sherman Alexie is a Native American writer. He takes he's a modern Native lit writer, and a lot of times his poetry focuses on sort of the disintegration of Native culture at the hands of particular vices, at the hands of white culture. So here he's looking at how Native culture has kind of devalued its own self by kind of commercializing itself. So he starts with these allusions to popular sort of figures. So Buffalo Bill is a caricature, it's a characterization that's stereotyping a Native American. It says Buffalo Bill opens a pawn shop on the reservation. So right here we have an ironic statement. We have something that's designed to make money on a reservation that is designed for the protection, where people can sell their goods and basically live off of the money to kind of further devalue their own selves and their own culture. So he says, right across the border from the liquor store. He says open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we have this very modern colloquial language. It's very straightforward. Again, we're in free verse here. He says the Indians, and notice that he writes without a lot of punctuation. He writes without proper grammar. We have run-ons, so we get this kind of crazed sort of train of thought kind of running through here. It says, and the Indians come running in with jewelry, TV sets, VCRs. So all these trappings of, sorry, apologies for the wrong spelling. All these trappings of modern consumer culture along with bits of their own sort of historical culture. And you see them conflated together, and they're selling off their own culture, essentially. Anything they can find to go get probably the liquor across the store is what it's implying. So he's using the imagery and the symbolism of these modern consumer objects to kind of represent how far the culture itself, not only the native culture, but American culture, has degraded in kind of its own identity. So he says, it took Inez Muse 12 years, the buckskin outfit that it took Inez, a person on the reservation, 12 years to finish. So somebody's selling off their grandmother's stuff. They're just selling off as fast as they can. Buffalo Bill, and then you see the break. So again, we have this sort of shift in how the language is being used here. He says, Buffalo Bill takes everything the Indians have to offer, keeps all catalogs and filed in a storage room. They pawn their hands, saving their thumbs for last. So we're moving into more abstract imagery here, where he says they pawn their skeletons, falling endlessly from the skin, and when the last Indian has pawned everything but his heart, Buffalo Bill takes that for $20. So you see that he's clearly talking about the sort of destruction of the culture and of the peoples as a whole, as they literally lose bits and pieces of themselves to this vice and to this modern culture. And he says, Buffalo Bill takes that $20. He closes the shop, paints a new sign of the old one, and says the Museum of Native American Cultures charges the Indians $5 a head to enter. So we have this white man who has taken all of these items from the Indians. He's taken literally pieces of themselves, and he turns it into an opportunity, a consumer opportunity, to make money off of Native culture, to appropriate the culture literally, and then to resell it, repackage it for the masses. So note that this last line here is satirical and ironic. And note the colloquial language that he's using. So he's talking about $5 a head to enter. That is modern and consumer-driven language. So that's Evolution by Sherman Alexie. We're going to read a really interesting one next by E Cummings, who was writing who was in World War I and actually abandoned his post and was very anti-war. So this poem is really about anti-blind patriotism. It's not necessarily anti-patriotism, because there is arguments that this actually is a very patriotic poem, but he's arguing against jingoism, which is basically patriotic fervor that we saw surrounding the wars, and sort of this idea of blindly following the patriotic masses. So again, we have a similar idea, and he says, and note that the way this is written. So it's one stanza and it runs together. There's no punctuation to break it up. So we get this kind of, this is the sort of inner rantings of this speaker. And it starts with, next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh. So we have this kind of rambling language that is kind of dismissive, and it's not respectful of what it's actually talking about. So he says, yes, 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 of course, next to God, I love America, obviously, land of the pilgrims. And he's E Cummings is using the speaker to kind of mock the idea that we claim this land as sort of patriotic right, but it's not even our land here. He says, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of centuries. So he's conflating and running together all of these sort of patriotic songs in a way that is incredibly dismissive and inaccurate. So we start to see the possibility that this is someone who is talking patriotic but doesn't actually understand the idea of patriotism. So we need to figure out who this speaker is. And it says, centuries come and go, and there are no more, and are no more what of it we should worry, in every language, even deaf and dumb. So this part here is very interesting because this is purposely run together, deaf and dumb. And he's basically saying that centuries have come and gone. We should no longer worry about sort of these patriotic struggles. What we should be worrying about is how we appear on the world stage. Foreign policy is more important than what's going on within America. And he says, he runs together deaf and dumb to show the idea that we can't even speak for ourselves anymore. We're just repeating all of these things we hear as blind patriots. He says, thy sons acclaim your glorious name by gory, probably gory as in gore, by jingo, by G, by gosh, by gum. So he's using all of this sort of language of the era and this hyper-patriotic language. And he's kind of pulling in all of these elements to say that the speaker is leveraging this language in a way that is inauthentic. So he's just spitting out these words, but they don't actually mean anything. And he says, why talk of beauty, and what can be more beautiful than these heroic happy dead? So that right there is an ironic statement. Who could be more beautiful than the dead, which is irony. These heroic happy dead. That is a juxtaposition. And he says, who rushed like lions to the roaring slaughter and did not stop to think, they died instead, then shall the voice of liberty be mute. So here the speaker is approaching this idea of blind patriotism, running into battle and dying for the sake of one's country. Did the soldiers even stop to think what they were fighting for? And was it really even worth it? Okay, so after all of this, we have a speaker. What Cummings does is he pulls us back out of the poem, and he sees that we have a speaker within a speaker. So we actually have someone who's been talking, and now we're back in the third person. And it says, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. So we get the idea that this person, whoever he was so dismissive of this idea, or just repeating phrases that he had heard and meant them completely inauthentically. It meant this very serious subject matter: death, war, destruction, patriotism. It's insignificant to him. He just spits it all out, and then he quietly drinks a glass of water. So this image that we have kind of introduces an ironic twist at the end that we as the reader don't necessarily see coming. And there's a lot more you can say about this poem, but I'm going to move on to The Flea by John Donne. This goes back to the idea of Robert Herrick and the pastoral. John Donne did write in the pastoral a lot. He was the same era, and he wrote a lot about sort of the Carpe Diem poetry, and The Flea is along the same lines. And here we have a speaker who's speaking to a silent listener, and we get the idea that these two are lovers, and he's talking about this flea, which represents a much larger idea here. And remember what I said about during this time period, these ideas of sex and sexual relations before marriage were not openly discussed. So he's discussing this idea through the symbol of the flea, but it is in a way that is subverted, and the imagery that he uses is representative of the idea of premarital sex. So he talks about this flea, and in this he says, "Mark but this flea." So he's talking to the speaker. He's the implied you. He says, "Mark you," essentially, "but this flea. And mark, look, in this, how little that which thou deniest me is." And he says, "The flea sucked me, and now it sucks thee." So it took my blood and then your blood. And it says, "In this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead." So he literally calls out the idea of losing virginity. He says, because the flea took your blood and my blood, it's mingled together. This is not a sin. And he says, and yet this enjoys before it woo, before it essentially court. So the pampered swell with one blood made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do. So he's literally suggesting the idea of sex in representation from this flea. And the idea of the swelling, the imagery of the swelling flea could represent what happens from sex during this time period, which of course is pregnancy. And he says, "Oh, stay 3 lives in 1 flea spare." So that could be 3 meaning the flea and the 2 people, or the 3 meaning the 2 people and a child. And he says, "Where we almost, nay, but more than married are." So we're almost married, but we're not quite married. And he's saying this idea, this sexual relation happening before marriage is essentially marriage. And this tone here is very cheeky. It's coy, and it's a little bit satirical. And he says, "This flea is you and I." So it literally is a metaphor. It represents you and I. It's a symbol. He said, "This is our marriage bed and marriage temple is." And then he goes on to talk about sort of the relationship. And he says, "Let not to that self-murder added be." So though yous make you apt to kill me. So he's saying, though you are killing me by not letting me be with you, don't let self-murder add that by killing the flea, because the flea is you and I. So he's saying, don't kill it, please, because then you're killing us, you're killing our love, you're killing the chances that we have. And then you see a change, a turn, as it's called in poetry, and he says, "Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence." So you see that she's killed, the unnamed speaker has killed the flea, and you get this imagery of purple blood on her nail, and it's innocent blood spilled. And he says, "Where could this flea be guilty except in the drop which is sucked from thee?" He said, "Yet thou triumphs and sayest thou findest not thyself nor me the weaker now." He says, "Yet you are very happy by killing this flea. You think nothing has changed." He says, "'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor when thou yieldst to me will waste as this flea's death took life from thee." So he says, when you do yield to me, you see how pointless this idea of honor and waiting until marriage is, just like this flea's death took life from thee. So it's supposed to be quite a cheeky poem, like I said. It's very coy, it's very subtle, but he's talking about a subject matter which at the time was really not talked about openly. So the last one here is Theme for English B. And again, we have Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was he was a student at Columbia, New York. He was the only African-American student in the class, and he didn't finish there because he went to go write. And so this poem comes from an idea of what it is to be Black in a white culture. So he says, you see the speaker is a student, and he says, "The instructor said, go home and write a page tonight and let that page come out of you, then it will be true." So he's saying, go home and write about who you are. And he starts to have these rhetorical questions. And he says, "I wonder if it's that simple." And then we have the speaker talking about who he is. And he says, I'm 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem, went to school there. And we have this, again, this very straightforward language that's kind of a narrative structure. And he's saying, I went to school on the hill above Harlem. I'm the only colored student in the class. And he talks about these sort of very specific images of New York City. So he's putting a locale on this poem, and he's giving you, the reader, an idea of exactly what life is here in Harlem. And he's saying, I'm sitting down to write this page. He goes, but I know it's not easy to know what is true for you or me. So by you, he could be talking to the instructor. He could be talking to white culture in general. At 22, my age, but I guess, and you note how he has the enjambment where he runs over. The lines run over into each other, and he says, but I guess I am what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you. So we have a different you here. We're shifting the focus to Harlem. We're personifying Harlem, and we're bringing Harlem to kind of life, and Harlem is part of his identity. He says, hear you, hear me, we two, you, me, talk on this page. So we have this connection between the two, and you'll note that we have the rhythm starting to settle in, even though, again, it's free verse. We have this rhythm settling, and that's kind of calling to mind the idea of jazz. He says, well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. So he likes the pleasures in life. He likes to work, read, learn, and understand. And then he calls in these sort of popular allusions. So he talks about Bessie, Bop, or Bach. So for Christmas present, he wants a record. So Bessie would be Bessie Smith, who is a famous African-American singer. Bop is, of course, Bop, the music of the time period, or Bach. So he's saying that even though he may live in Harlem, he can be appreciative of all these kinds of music and all these different cultures. And so he's saying we're not that different. He says, I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like. So will my page be colored that I write? So we have this imagery of colored or white paper. And he says, being me, it will not be white, but it will be part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. So he's saying we're not that different, we're not that separate, and yet there's an insurmountable difference purely driven by culture here, by color and culture, that cannot be bridged. So he's saying we're at once separate, but also very similar. And he says, and sometimes perhaps you, white culture, don't want to be a part of me. And he says, nor do I often want to be a part of you, but we are, that's true. So this idea of American melting pot, and he's acknowledging that we have a lot of differences and a lot of times when we don't want to be a part of each other, his culture and white culture, but he's saying we have to learn from each other, essentially. And he says, I guess you learn from me, although you're older and white and somewhat more free. This is my page for English B. So that is a selection of poetry, and you guys are going to go ahead and move on.